For those that aren't familiar, my name is Rick Rossow. I hold the chair in U.S. India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic International Studies. And our program focuses really on three different things: the U.S. India defense relations, India's state level economic reforms, but also national level economic reforms. This is actually an annual event, one of the few that we pull together kind of on a regular basis, and a particularly fascinating time, I think, to talk about the Indian economy. We just had a release of some relatively strong GDP numbers. India continues to overperform in terms of large economies. You have some great announcements coming out of major global manufacturers, particularly in the telecom sector, choosing to make big block investments in India. And yet at the same time, we see some weakness in some of the key externals. When you look at India's goods trade, when you look at foreign direct investment inflows, the numbers aren't quite so cheery. Our India Economic Reform Scorecard, if you take a look, since we're pretty much nearing the end of the Modi government's second term, a little bit less orientation on major economic reforms and also foreign direct investment reforms during the second term. And I know a lot of folks believe that's partially due to the fact that you had this dramatic COVID wave take place during the second term. But actually, a lot of the big reforms the Modi government had done were in the middle of the COVID wave, and foreign direct investment numbers actually spiked during the middle of the COVID wave. So COVID actually had a strange impact where it actually triggered a lot of foreign direct investment inflows, and also a lot of the government's major reforms they did during its second term were really in the depths of COVID. Now, we also feel that with an election coming up, sometimes there's a belief that big reforms tend to take a pause right around election time. Happy to report just this morning, after a cabinet decision last week, that the Ministry of Commerce and Industry issued a new press note that opens up foreign direct investment in the commercial space sector. So yeah, sometimes even just before elections, you still see governments undertaking big reforms. But a lot of the attention is going to be on the election. What are some of the announcements the government makes as part of their campaign pledges? Who wins the election, and what are the first things they do when they take office? Now, here in Washington, D.C., think tank land, a lot of us on the India beat, we write, we talk, we have events. We try to hope and believe that maybe some of the things that we do have some resonance to policymakers. But part of the reason we pull this event together, because if you talk about real impact, the ratings groups and what that means for financial institutions and where they put money, they have a much more tangible impact in terms of trying to help trigger and guide investment flows around the world. So it really is a pleasure to once again host ratings leads from both Standard & Poor's and Moody's to help set the table as we look at the Indian economy in the coming year, and some of the big issues that they're tracking, and I'm sure even taking a look back to some extent as well. And for those of us, the India wonks like myself, it's also really important to, I think, first set the stage and talk a bit about what's happening in the globe, since of course that's going to have an impact as well on what happens in India. And I'm so pleased that my colleague Romina Bandura from the Project on Prosperity and Development here at CSIS was able to join as well. So let me introduce the speakers, and I'll hand it over to them to make some introductory remarks and talk about a real global perspective coming from these issues at multiple angles. First, we're going to have, of course, I mentioned Romina, who's a senior fellow at the Project on Prosperity and Development. She'd spent long innings at the Economist Intelligence Unit, UN Development Program, as well as time in the private sector. Joydeep Mukherji, as I say every time that we make this opening, Joydeep was one of my original gurus 25 years ago when I was working at the U.S. India Business Council, and really helping me kind of understand major parts of the Indian economy and how the center states work together. So Joydeep, it's really terrific to have you here again. You've been since we created this series, so it's great to have you. And Christian de Guzman, who is a Senior Vice President and Manager of Financial Institutions Group at Moody's, joining us from Singapore. So thanks for staying up late into the evening. And of course, Christian, Monetary Authority of Singapore. He'd done multilateral as well with the IMF, as well as in the private sector with JP Morgan and Procter & Gamble. So all of our speakers have a terrific set of experiences in government, in multilateral, in private sector. And I can't ask for a better tee-up than that. But Romina, the floor is yours. First, set the stage and the context, what's happening in the world that us India wonks should know about. And thanks again for joining.
Of course, and thank you, Rick, for inviting me to this important discussion today. It's a pleasure to be here and also share the event with Christian and Joydeep. And hello to everyone that are watching us. As Rick mentioned, I will focus my remarks on global issues and trends that will impact the Indian economy in the short run, and I would say also in the medium run. There are four global developments I will briefly discuss. First, as you know, wars are disrupting trade and commodity prices. Second, increasing geostrategic risks. The third, I would say, technology and digital transformation. And the fourth is nearshoring. I would say out of the fourth, two are development. Of these developments are risks for India, and two are more of represent opportunities for the Indian economy. So what are some of the risks I see? First, we will continue to see trade and commodity price disruptions, given that the world is experiencing two interconnected conflicts. We have Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, which is going into its third year. And actually, it's 10 years since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. And the second big conflict is, of course, Hamas's October 2023 attack on Israel and subsequent war. So although geographically these wars are contained for now, they affect everyone, including countries of the global south, through energy price increases, fertilizer and food flow interruptions, shipping disruptions, and potentially retrenchment in investment to the global south. So these conflicts are affecting the most important shipping routes through the Black Sea, the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz. I just read a statistic from UN, from UNCTAD, that estimates that the trade volume going through the Suez Canal decreased by 42% over the last 2 months because of the war in Israel. And recently you have also Houthi rebels in Yemen that have been attacking ships in the Red Sea, to provide support to the Palestinians. What I would say is that the longer these conflicts last, the higher the risk of escalation and spillover to neighbors, and in turn, this can create greater disruption. In the case of India, I would say India's position on Ukraine is a bit disappointing, given that Russia has violated basic sovereignty principles enshrined at the UN and embraced by all nations. India has not condemned Russia at the UN. In fact, it has a little bit taken advantage of the situation and intensified its trade relationship with Russia. Perhaps in the short run, India is gaining from its import of cheap Russian oil and weaponry and fertilizers, but this is a short-term bet that can backfire in the long run, depending on how Russia's economy fares in the future. The second risk I'm going to discuss, and it's related to these conflicts, is something a little bit more concerning, which is increased geopolitical risk that will become even more complicated in the years to come. As you know, international relations are becoming more complex. We have great power competition between China and the US, which economically can manifest itself in trade wars, supply disruptions, and deglobalization. As a result, the world is becoming more polarized. You have a club of Western liberal order countries led by the US and Europe, and a club that follows more authoritarian values led by China, Russia, and of course, Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. How India balances its international position vis-a-vis its national interests is something that the Indian leadership will have to address increasingly in the future. Rick, of course, is an expert on the U.S. India relations, but I think a more complicated aspect is India's relations with China, Russia, and Pakistan, and the relevance, if at all, of the BRICS coalition. These tensions might become more front burner issues than back burner issues in the years to come. It may not unravel this year, but it's a risk that probably needs to be added to, your forecast scenarios. Within this context, I would say, I want to go on the brighter side of things. There are two global developments that present opportunities for the Indian economy. And I would say, of course, as you know, the first is technology and digital transformation, including digital public infrastructure. India is a leader in technology and DPI. It has shown its leadership on these issues in the last G20 meetings. The key will be how India adopts technology so that they do not create more inequality, especially within the formal sector and between the formal and the informal, or not disorganized, but the informal sector in India. How India leads and adjusts to digitalization will be especially important for its labor market. The second, I would say, opportunity for India, of course, is the prospect of nearshoring, with supply chains shifting away from China. This presents a big opportunity for India in sectors including manufacturing, chemicals, pharma, textiles, and of course, its defense industrial base. But India will also feel competition stemming from other regions that are, also want to be nearshoring centers and are closer to the U.S. market. And I would say, this is Central America. To conclude, these are some of the current issues that will impact India both in the short run and I would say in the medium run. And so with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'll turn now back to Rick.
Thanks, Romina. Really powerful and important scene setter. And I think, again, for those of us that live in the India lane, good to take a breath of fresh air and remember that there's a lot happening in the world that's going to impact even the best laid plans that we may be trying to plan and prepare for. Joydeep, let me hand the floor over to you, a longtime India watcher, and would love to hear your perspectives, especially as we head into election season. What do you got your eyes on right now? Floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you for a very generous introduction. I'll give you maybe a snapshot of where India is and what are the challenges or opportunities in the future. And I'll start off with the sovereign credit rating of India. S&P rates India at BBB minus with a stable outlook. And in our scale, BBB minus is an investment grade. And amongst all the countries that we rate in the world, 137 countries, India is the country with the lowest per capita income to still be in investment grade, which in a sense tells you that there's an institutional and political framework there, which is proportionately better compared with other countries at the same level of development. And I think that's key in terms of looking at the future as to what might happen, especially after the elections this year. Our credit rating of India has certain strengths and weaknesses. The biggest strength is the ability to have rapid economic growth going back decades, not just for a couple of years, but if you go back from the 90s onwards, the growth rate has been 6%, sometimes went up to 7, 8, some years it went down, but 6 to 7% has been sort of an average number for 30 years. And that sustains everything. That's the key for the rating and many other things. The other strength of India from our angle is its external position, meaning its trade and investment flows with the rest of the world. Without going into the jargon and numbers, let's just say that India is not very vulnerable to external threats the way other countries might be when there's an increase in the price of oil or some other international developments. That doesn't mean it's not affected or hurt by these events, but the balance sheet, so to speak, is pretty strong. And those are the positive things that sort of drive the rating. On the negative side, won't come as any surprise to most India watchers that India's fiscal deficit, which is very large, and its debt burden, its government debt as a share of GDP, which is also very large. Those are the factors that are constraining the rating, preventing it from moving up. I think monetary policy in India is fairly, I would say, is almost like a moderately positive, but closer to neutral factor. It's supportive. It's helping the economy, but it's not driving a potential increase in the rating. Now, turning to how we see the country, let me start off with politics and then move to some other areas. Um, I think the first thing to tell, and probably an audience like this doesn't need to be told the details, is that there's a generational change in India, like in many countries, and what I would call the post-1991 generation, the people who either were born after the reform started in 1991, or who may have been born earlier but were deeply affected by the changes unleashed by the 1991 reform. Those people are now basically running the country. They may not all be in higher positions, but they are setting the tone. They are the dominant group, and they're changing the country, just like in any other country where you have a displacement of generations. And part of that change has led to a displacement of the traditional elites in India, whether it's academic, business, political, or social elites. And we see that. And whenever you have elite change, especially in a big country, you're going to have a lot of noise. And so one of the reasons that news from India is very polemical, very divisive. You get news saying everything's wonderful, or get news saying everything is falling apart. Reality is in the middle. But one of the reasons you have that is basically because you have a generation that's being displaced and they're screaming and they're very loud, and another generation that's coming in and they're also talking loudly. So you have to look beneath that to see what's going on. And without getting into the details, let's just say that there's a new orientation amongst the people who are now taking over the running of the country. And to put it in a very summary manner, what we have basically is a country that's perhaps best described as being more comfortable in its own skin. Now, that's controversial because others will say they don't like what's going on, but that's another issue for another panel. Let me move on to the economic side. I think the notable part here is beyond the growth numbers and the decline in poverty over the last several decades, what's more impressive perhaps is the consensus behind the key economic policies we look at. Whether they're great policies or not, there's a remarkable consensus right now. Economic policy is not really debated very much in India. Rick mentioned announcements to open up the space sector for foreign investment. If you look at the announcements to build semiconductor facilities in India, these don't attract political controversy. The opposition parties talk about other things, but really there's not a huge difference or even a substantial difference on key economic policies between the major parties. What are those policies? I think one is to promote investment, broadly speaking. Another is just to promote economic growth through investment. And I think there's a sense that the private sector needs to be strengthened because that's going to be the engine of growth in the future. However, there doesn't seem to be much support for reducing the public sector. There has been privatization, especially Air India, but that seems to be sort of a lukewarm policy. And again, not much controversy in the political world about the role of the public sector either. There is a better consensus, I would say, on creating a safety net for the poor. And one thing I want to stress is if you look at India's history compared with Southeast Asia or China or other countries, when India started doing economic reforms, its social welfare indicators like poverty or malnutrition or other social indicators were much worse than in Southeast Asia or even China when they started their reforms. So in the sense, the social legs of the economy were weak. And it's taken a long time for that to be addressed. And what we've seen in the last few years is a rapid expansion in food, provision of food to basically more than half the population, rapid expansion in social welfare services, whether it's providing liquefied petroleum gas for cooking or cash transfers or healthcare program, the new Ayushman Bharat program. These programs are addressing some of the basic needs of the population, and they enjoy widespread political support. And it's important to stress this because unless you increase the social fabric and the social health of the country, it'll be difficult to take full advantage of the economic reforms that are going on. And I think that's happened in the last few years. Modi may be popular in the business community, but he's also become very popular with a huge expansion of social welfare. So you can call it a right-wing policy and a left-wing policy combined in one. And connected with that, another factor to stress is there has been a strengthening of the ability of the Indian state to deliver services. I don't mean just the federal government. I also mean some of the state governments as well. A lot of the policies that have come in recent years are not new. They were announced or somehow promoted by previous governments. The problem was always delivery. Can you get the money to the last mile, to the last person? I think that has been a huge improvement. And as I said, that's, I think, countrywide. It's not just at the national level. And that the best example of that is the infrastructure program. You know, every government's wanted to build infrastructure. Lots of projects have been announced, but now you finally see a much better execution. So that is also notable and should continue in the future. Finally, digitization. Everyone's talking about that. I won't go into any details, but I would just say that India has its own digital public infrastructure model. It's a lot of people are talking about that. And it is interesting to see how this works out. What is the role of the private sector? What is the role of the public sector in the new digital architecture that we're all going to be living under? No one has the right answer, but I think there's a lot of experimentation and so far some pretty good results in India as to how to build this thing. This is always going to be a work in progress, but I think this is key, especially if we're talking about artificial intelligence and all the changes that are scaring most of us. Whether a country is able to harness that or not depends in large part on the infrastructure and regulatory framework for digitalization. So that's something to keep an eye on. Now, that's a relatively positive view of what's going on. What are the negatives? So what are the drawbacks? I think I would start off with the things that most people know quite well. There's still a very low level of average education and average skill. The workforce, there are obviously large pockets of very skilled workers, but labor, education, human skilling, things like that have been relatively disappointing. They have improved. There has been a big increase in the coverage of the education system. The average quality, however, is probably not improved in tandem with the coverage. So that's a big challenge because you may have lots of people who are semi-educated or semi-skilled who feel they should get a better job than what's on offer, but frankly, they're just not qualified for the better jobs. So this is a big challenge, and it's an ongoing challenge. There were two reforms that Modi tried and failed. One was land acquisition law. The second was agricultural modernization. Huge setbacks in both of those reforms. Let's see if he tries again and if he gets a third term. But I think, there's just no way of getting around it. You need to have both those reforms in order to modernize agriculture and to speed up the growth rate from the current levels. Finally, I would just say climate change. This is a huge topic. India is very seized of the need to do something on climate change and has done quite a lot, especially in renewable energy. However, much of the water in the country comes from the glaciers in the Himalayas. And so it is going to be a serious, serious challenge. So looking at the next few years, how do we see the country? Most people expect Modi will win comfortably in the elections that are coming up. If that's the case, there'll probably be a renewed emphasis on modernization, meaning more infrastructure, more sort of industrial policy, as we've seen with semiconductors and the production-linked incentive schemes, and more focus on digital technology. There'll probably be broad continuity in fiscal and monetary policy, and I suspect the government will probably move to putting in a uniform civil code, which means basically getting rid of Sharia law for the Muslim community and bringing Muslim personal law into a secular law. That'll be controversial, but I have a feeling that that's going to happen. There have been so many signals on that front. So looking to the future, what could change? I think for the better, if you see a government that deepens down more on the kind of reforms I mentioned, you have a better chance of having a growth rate of 8%, which people aspire to. It's not guaranteed, but I think it's more likely if the reform is picked up again. And on the negative side, people make mistakes. Policy mistakes happen everywhere. There's always a risk of that. In the last few years, as Rick was alluding to in terms of the policies that were made during the pandemic, which actually brought in more foreign investment, you could see there was a record of good policies. Let's hope that there's not a record of bad policies or accidents after the election, but I think they're seized of the issue. And finally, I would just say that in a country as diverse as India, there are always going to be surprises, social surprises, regional issues that come up. And so maintaining social harmony and containing regional tensions, whatever the cause, is going to be a perennial challenge. I don't see that as being a threat that's necessarily higher today than in the past, but it's always there. So on the whole, I think a positive story, but still a lot of work to be done to attain the ambitions that the country has. Back to you, Rick.
Thanks, Joydeep. I love the point on foreign investment. I think I've mentioned in some other forums before that, it used to be with previous prime ministers when I had industry jobs, we'd have to sneak CEOs in to meet privately with prime ministers because they didn't want to know that they were trying to encourage investment. And I think Prime Minister Modi understood that the country was actually more accepting and welcoming of foreign investment and the jobs that would come than what predecessors had seen. So, that quick turnaround and approach and embrace of investors on stage at big forums, was a little head spinning. And I pine for the days when I used to work at U.S IBC, and it was so hard to do something like that visibly and publicly and feel the love back a bit. So it's a good point. Christian, you're close to the action in Singapore. A lot of ground yet to cover here. I think a lot of topics covered, but some not. So I'd love to hear your perspectives on India prospects as well. Thanks for joining.
Great. Thanks, Rick, and thanks for teeing me up, Joydeep, because I would say that I think we do agree with a lot of things that Joydeep had mentioned. And perhaps of particular interest to this audience, since we last spoke last year, we did affirm India's Baa3 rating with a stable outlook. So I think that kind of implies that, as kind of Joydeep had sort of summarized, there is a mixture of positives versus negatives, and in a sort of forward-looking basis. But let me just sort of encapsulate, I guess, just the key thrusts behind that affirmation of that Baa3 rating, which, similar to S&P's positioning, that is still an investment grade rating. It is the lowest investment grade rating, but as Joydeep had mentioned, we're looking at a very low GDP per capita, but very high growth. So these sort of things kind of balance out. I mentioned that because the first thing that we cited in terms of affirming the rating is recognizing that that growth in India is going to be very high on an absolute and relative basis. We do expect that India is going to be resilient to the very challenging global environment, and this is because perhaps this is the flip side of that lack of FDI. This is a very domestically dependent economy. Dependent on consumption, dependent on private investment coming from onshore sources, dependent on government spending, especially with regards to infra. The focus on infra that we've seen over the past couple of years. We also noted that there has been underlying structural change in the economy, which has enabled that sort of resilience of the Indian economy despite that challenging global environment. And Joydeep had mentioned some of them already. There is digitalization, there is that infrastructure development, and I think let's not forget the banking system is in pretty good shape after the sort of wholesale cleanup of the corporate sector, of corporate balance sheets, and just the cleanup of financial sector balance sheets. So they are now able to lend again. And meet the demands of a very fast growing economy. So all those are really taken into consideration already. But at the same time, the other thing we cited is, yes, the government has made strides towards developing a very nascent track record of fiscal discipline. That hasn't always been the case. I think many of the people in this call know. But for several years now, for 3 or 4 years now, we have seen a gradual pace of fiscal consolidation emerging from the pandemic, and that is along with that sort of high growth, putting the government within reach of that 4.5% of GDP, the union government level, as continuing to be emphasized by the finance minister by 2025-26. So that is within reach. But I think we also wanted to emphasize is, yes, that's pretty good for in the Indian context, but our ratings are often comparative in nature. And when we look at the central government deficits across the region, especially amongst rating peers, even with the initial budget that was announced last month, we are still looking at a situation where an Indian central government deficit is wider than BAA rated emerging market Asian peers like Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia. So is it ready? Are we ready to sort of acknowledge that there has been a material improvement relative to others? Not quite yet. And that's just the deficits. We're still looking at a very highly indebted economy. Probably at least in the investment grade space, the largest debt burden amongst emerging markets. And along that comes the risks behind that high debt in the context of still elevated interest rates. I don't think anybody is expecting the Fed to really get back to that sort of zero interest rate environment. We are the House view here is one of a higher for longer interest rate environment, and that is going to influence liquidity conditions and interest rates globally. So that means there is going to be higher interest rates paid on that very high level of government debt going forward. Simply put, the extent of fiscal consolidation that we have seen so far is not going to be material enough to really change our current assessment of very weak fiscals for India. And one last thing is just that we have also tried to sort of recalibrate our positioning related to once again some of those things that Joydeep had mentioned. It's a very noisy political sort of environment, and we have calibrated our political risk assessment accordingly. We've lowered our political risk score, meaning there is greater susceptibility to political risk. This does not mean that we're expecting any sort of extra constitutional changes in power or very messy transfer or conduct of elections going forward, but there are these issues that we observe. The sectarian violence, whether you're talking about some of the community tensions with the Muslim population, or what's going on in Manipur, and let's not also forget cross-border tensions with China and Pakistan. So there are these things which made us rethink our assessment of political risk. Simply put, when we compare it to others, we no longer thought that political risk should be in India consistent with what we see in a Switzerland, for example. I guess the one other thing here is just that we did acknowledge an improvement in governance. We have seen enough in terms of the way the RBI had overseen the repair of the financial sector, as I had mentioned. We've seen enough with regards to their implementation of which is probably the world's newest inflation targeting regime. This, it's been less than 10 years since this has happened, and we've seen material improvements with regards to things like capital markets as a result. So we have seen enough, and so we have increased our assessment of governance more broadly for India. So here again, perhaps I just want to highlight that there is a mixture of positives and the sort of still negatives, although improving a little bit, but that kind of encapsulates where we are with India. Now back to you, Rick.
Thanks, Christian. And especially what you mentioned on political risk, very, very important, I think, for people in our audience as a kind of a defense think tank. They love kind of hearing how much, if at all, some of these issues of vying for competition between India and China, does it really kind of have an impact on how groups like yours take a look? So I do appreciate you taking a few minutes to lay that out, because it doesn't always get nearly as much coverage, and not everybody kind of understands. And actually, it's a great, I think, switch to throw something over to Romina based on something that she mentioned, which includes India, China, which is this concept of the global South. To me, sometimes it feels in conferences like there's this big army running around looking for a boss, right? Everybody wants to be leader of the global South, leader of the global South. And I keep looking for the headquarters. Where's the global South headquartered? What is this thing? It feels strange, amorphous, and yet everybody seems to be trying to grab leadership of the global South. I know the contest we see, between the United States and China, and of course, India, at least for its own region, or maybe has broader global aspirations, is kind of hungry for that. But, you with a wider perspective, looking so closely at Europe and Latin America, when this global South discussion comes up and you hear a lot of countries raising their hands and believing that they have a role to play for leadership, how does that kind of resonate with you? What does it kind of look like? What does it mean? And are there other factors at play than just simply this binary or maybe trilateral conversation that a lot of us seem to be kind of wrapped up in?
Sure. So, the world is a very different place since 1991, and I would say, the global South is an amorphous term, obviously, but it's like the new term de jour. Developing countries obviously have more agency, have better human capital, have better trade relationships than, since 1991. So of course they're, a very important actor right now in the global economy. What I would say is Africa, Asia, Latin America see this great power competition between U.S. and China as more of like maybe transactional, right? They do a lot of the global South countries do align with the values of the U.S. and of Europe, of the international liberal order that was set after World War II. But they also see the value of China as an investor, as a financier. China provides a lot of the infrastructure, digital connectivity, and so I think that the global South is a little bit sandwiched between these values and then the transactions, right? So I would say it's more they take a transactional approach, and you see it played out in international organizations at the UN or maybe other forums. Uh, the BRICS coalition, I would say, is one of the where you can see the leadership of the global South try to exert themselves, but I don't know if this is a useful coalition, if they they do much, and you can see also some cracks. Argentina said it won't join BRICS, so we'll see what happens in the next years to come, but there are some forums where the global South are trying to exert themselves compared to the US and China.
Oh, thanks. I look at, transactional. I love you kind of put that tagline on it, because if India were to try to step up and be a leader of the global South, something tells me they're going to have to dip into national finances a little more significantly to start moving a lot more money into the countries. Over half of India's development aid right now just goes to their tiny neighbor, Bhutan. So if it's transactional, it could have a real impact on the Indian economy if they really wanted to step up in the ways I think a lot of countries are kind of eager. So I do appreciate that. Joydeep, looking at center versus states, of course, we have a national election coming up, but at the same time, you're actually going to have a few state elections. They're talking about actually bringing state elections potentially on the same schedule as national. We saw 5 years ago in the election in Andhra Pradesh with the new government and a dramatic change in a lot of the policies and revoking contracts the previous government had signed on energy in the national capital. Something similar almost 5 years ago in Maharashtra, which has an election coming up where you saw a lot of change with the new government. How much does state level policy making, if at all, sort of impact how S&P looks at India writ large? Is it meaningful? Is it growing? Or is it less than what you consider, since you're sort of rating the national sovereign? So talk a little bit about state reform and impact and what that means for you.
Sure. This is a huge topic, and states or subnational governments form part of our analysis of every country. So if we're rating Canada, the sovereign rating of Canada would incorporate the fiscal position, the debt position of the provinces of Canada. So the same thing in India. Most of the debt is held by the national government, but states do have a lot of debt, and they contribute 2 or 3 points of GDP to the deficit of the consolidated general government. So they are linked completely in terms of our analysis, in terms of economic policy, all of that. The other part of it is the delivery. Most of the things that people actually receive from the government tend to come from a state government, whether it's the United States or India. the money often comes as a transfer in one form or another from the central government, but much of the delivery, most roads, law and order, education, things like that. And so in that sense, you cannot get around the states. You can give them more resources or more autonomy or put more rules upon them. All of that has been tried in India. But what you see is a mixed performance. There are some states, including states run by opposition parties, not the BJP, who are doing well and are actually cooperating well with the national government in implementing policies. There are other states which are not doing well for whatever reason, and some opposition states which are going out of their way not to cooperate with the national government. That's the usual tension you get in many federal systems. It's not unique to India. But despite that kind of politics as usual, and incidents like you mentioned where people have not honored contracts signed by the previous government, I think in general, there has been an improvement at the state level. Certainly compared, I'm talking not compared to a year or two ago, but you go back to 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, to where we are right now. In general, there has been an improvement, but this is a big challenge because it's a federal country, it's a diverse country, and at some point, the impact of central government reforms will exhaust itself on certain issues because somebody else has to do the rest of the work. And so I'm cautiously optimistic there, but I don't see a dramatic change in the next couple of years in terms of the issues that you mentioned.
Thanks, Joydeep. Yeah, it's an area we saw of, I think, real strength early in Modi government's first term when they really tried to hold states accountable, but less, I think, interest and excitement in doing that during the second term. But it'd be great to see them go back to the well, more transparency, more accountability of state policymaking, and I appreciate that perspective. Christian, obviously, ratings agencies have come under scrutiny in India to some extent. About methodology, it feels like, to a lot of people that are reading the papers and you see these economic numbers that the ratings should be dramatically higher. For a generalist audience, maybe you can talk a little bit about what methodology looks like. I think it'd be very instructive for those that maybe have seen some of these headlines about, is it some magical formula nobody can kind of understand? So maybe you can spend a bit, you mentioned briefly on political risk, but what does it kind of look like, inside the machine? Thanks.
Sure. Great. Thanks. Yes. As Rick had alluded to, I think there has been greater attention on the ratings, and this kind of sort of rhetoric has also been kind of originated from the government itself. Clearly, they believe that they deserve something better. But maybe just very briefly, I will touch on how what that box looks like, that magic box looks like. And then maybe perhaps touch on, I guess, some of the arguments being put forth by the government and by the punditry in India with regards to India's sovereign rating. But broadly speaking, the way I had outlined our decision to affirm the Baa3 rating does correspond to our methodological framework. And that isn't dependent solely on economic performance. As I mentioned earlier, we do think that India is going to be one of the top performers in the global economy, which is currently being challenged by two wars, tight global liquidity conditions, and much more. And India does stand out. We are acknowledging that, but that's not the only thing we look at. Part of that underlying assessment of economic strength also includes things like the low GDP per capita, and the sort of susceptibility of growth to sort of environmental considerations. I mean, we all are still looking at how monsoons are going to affect agricultural production. So we are looking at some of these longer term vulnerabilities and trying to see through that sort of cyclical patterns that we see on the quarterly releases of GDP growth. The second thing we look at is institutional strength, and broadly speaking, we're looking at quality and effectiveness. So here, quality, I think we've expressed some concern with regards to just the political goings on, the perceived weaknesses of the civil society and judiciary. So even though as this government, we have given kudos in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, improving our assessment of governance as it relates to policy effectiveness, that growing track record of fiscal discipline for the past couple of budgets, plus the increasing policy effectiveness on the part of the RBI. This is balanced out by, the perceptions that there is a weakening of civil society and judiciary in the country, perhaps as mirrored by, what looks to be somewhat of a suppression of unfavorable media by the government, for example. We are looking at some of these qualitative considerations like the rule of law, simply because what we're rating are pieces of paper, promises written on a piece of paper. And to the extent that governments can honor that promise on a piece of paper, we are looking at how the government protects or abides by things like the rule of law, and we encapsulate that in our assessment of the quality of institutions. The other thing we look at, and the weak point, and what would perhaps prompt us to sort of really reassess the rating is that fiscal strength, the very high debt to GDP, the still wide fiscal deficits, and probably just as important, the relatively poor debt affordability. I think I mentioned this last year. I think many on the ground pat the governments on the back by saying you're spending a lot on infrastructure. But I think what's often overlooked is the government is still spending a lot more on interest payments than they are on infrastructure. So that is a key thing for us. There's really not much that much more flexibility in the absence of more material uptick in revenue performance. So fiscal strength is still one of those weak points. And lastly, I think we look at what we look at as event risk, and that's really an amalgamation of banking sector risk, external vulnerability risk, which, as Joydeep had mentioned, is very strong, not a worry for us, political risk, and government liquidity risk. And all these, I think, really sort of interact with the first three factors generally. But let me just touch on some of the arguments that are being put forth that are quite popular on the ground right now. India has not defaulted even over the course of the pandemic, and even over the course of somewhat of a financial crisis that we saw in the late 2010s. Well, that's not a criteria for an upgrade. I think we would remind the public that most sovereign countries have not defaulted. That includes most non-investment grade countries. So that really is not a reason for a higher rating. Most countries in the world, yes, we did see an uptick in the instances of sovereign defaults over the course of the pandemic and the aftermath. But the fact is, most countries, the vast majority of countries, have never defaulted or have not defaulted in the past 20 to 30 years. There is this criticism that perhaps rating agencies are biased against developing countries. I just need to remind everyone that we have a negative outlook on the United States, perhaps as a rejoinder to that. But what's been quoted by the chief economic advisor is that perhaps the larger proportion of African countries that were downgraded versus European countries. Well, when you look at what happened during the pandemic, a lot of the stresses came from liquidity. And where is that liquidity most prevalent? It's really prevalent in a lot of advanced economies. And so it is natural to see why in the face of oncoming debt repayments, that we saw a lot of stress in countries where that liquidity is lacking and where access to financing was quite constrained. So really, it wasn't about this is a developing country and they're poor and they're being really affected by the pandemic. It's not that. It's really a whole host of things, and we do not have a different methodology for advanced economies and a different methodology for developing economies. And maybe lastly, I think a popular refrain from the government is our rating is stuck. Well, that's not true. I mean, they will cite, well, our rating was Baa3, back in the 2000s, but I would point that the rating that matters is the local currency rating. They're talking about the foreign currency rating, which, yes, indeed, for Moody's has not moved in quite a while. But for the local currency rating, it matters because the bulk almost the entire majority of debt is in local currency. That has moved quite considerably, 2 or 3 notches over the past 10, 15 years. It has gone up all the way up to Baa2. We did downgrade just prior to the pandemic because of the stresses that we saw in the financial system and growth and what it meant for the fiscals. So it has gone up and it has gone down. It is not stuck. We do continue to respond to developments as we see them if they are material. So back to you, Rick.
Thanks, Christian. Very instructive. I'm sure we could probably have an entire panel just breaking down in further detail. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interest in doing that, but I appreciate that for those of us that aren't experts. Your expert way on trying to share some of the high level methodology behind it. We got about 6 minutes. We've had a couple questions come in, and so I'll try to swamp those in as I lay a couple things out. Romina, looking at U.S. engagement with India on commercial issues, the United States has actually, in some ways, been cheering outbound investment into India by U.S. semiconductor firms and other technology firms because we both agree we were a little over-reliant on China for security reasons because of supply chain disruptions during COVID. And that's been a big driver in U.S.-India commercial relations, the shared concern about China dominating, at least in technology areas. Is that a shared concern, would you say, when you get outside the Indo-Pacific? Are other countries concerned about over-reliance on Chinese 5G and solar panels and all the things that really kind of drive the relations between U.S. and India together? Is that apparent in your view, looking outside the Indo-Pacific?
Thanks, Rick. I don't think so. So I again, as I mentioned, the countries in the global South welcome these investments and from China. I would say not investments, but mainly loans. So I would caution about the debt issue. I know Christian mentioned it, but today, the debt that these developing countries hold are, a large percentage, at least, in Africa and elsewhere, is held by China, and it's not, the IFIs or the Wall Street or banks. So I would say that's a little bit of a concern. And then, you mentioned the issues of, surveillance of these technologies and how, technologies can be also used, to propagate more authoritarian values within, these developing countries. So I would say in general, no, but there is a little bit, countries are starting to, realize that the Chinese way of doing, business comes with some strings attached. So, you need to be, a little bit more careful going forward.
Thanks. Joydeep, I think we got time for one more question, and this again kind of links to one of the questions that came in online. But when you talk about the 3 basic components, manufacturing, services, and agriculture, you have a lot of people in agriculture producing relatively little, relatively few people in services producing a lot, and manufacturing just kind of stuck in the middle, right? I mean, 10 years after Make in India, and its manufacturing is still stuck at about 14% of GDP. When you look to the future, can you envision a future where services is such a driver that relatively low-skilled labor will find opportunities in services that can be the driver? Or do you think that a new government has really got to double and triple down its work on Make in India to try to create a lot of low and mid-skilled manufacturing and assembly jobs? Is there a pathway driven by services, do you think? Or Make in India, it's got to be another round of all in to try to get that going?
It's going to be a mixture of both. Ideally, had India taken different policies, a couple of decades ago, then the growth of low-skilled manufacturing would have been much bigger than it has been. But that opportunity has to some extent gone away. The world in general is moving towards services and higher skilled output. So what was possible 20, 30 years ago may not be fully possible today. Nevertheless, it's still possible, even within current conditions, to expand low-skilled manufacturing. It's just not happening at a very rapid pace. But the future, if you had to bet on something in the future, it would be high-skilled and it would be services, because that's where the new growth is coming from. And the good news is India is pretty well positioned for that. For a country where the average per capita income is still relatively low, the number of people, the huge number of people who are skilled and able to work in the modern futuristic sectors is quite high. And that's going to drive growth. And to some extent, that's going to drag up the rest of the economy where you have lower skilled people. However, if you had a better mix with a larger role, not a dominant role, but at least a larger role for low skilled manufacturing, the pattern of growth could perhaps have been more equitable, shared the wealth a little bit more. So, I mean, I think this is a challenge, but in some ways, there's also an opportunity because it is also good to have a very high presence, almost a premature presence, given your level of development in the high tech sectors, because that is going to drive growth in the future. But the growth pattern, as I said, could have been better.
Thanks, Joydeep. Yeah. You know, as my old friend Gurcharan Das wrote, India grows at night. So, you know, the high-end services maybe isn't getting as much policy attention, but that can be a good thing sometimes. So, you know, we all opine about what the policy-making functions are going to be of a new government, but maybe some of the areas that are ignored are the ones that have a higher chance of success sometimes. But Romina, Joydeep, Christian, thanks for joining us today. Really kind of rolling out, Romina, some of the big global issues between conflict and opportunity that are going to potentially influence externally what we see in India. But, you know, Joydeep, a lot of the factors that you talked about, Christian, how rating agencies approach it in more of a programmatic way. This has been an enlightening hour, and I deeply appreciate you all giving so much time. Thanks to you, and thanks to the audience for being here today.
Thank you.